1 Chronicles 21. Let's call this one Why, because it goes to a question that Joab, David's general, is going to ask him that David is going to apparently ignore when he decides, I want to take a census because I want to know how many folks I got in Israel, at which point Joab is going to ask him the question, why? But the chapter, at least in the ESV, is going to say David's word simply prevails over Joab, who he sent out along with the commanders of the army to take the census. They do it. Makes it apparent that Joab is reluctant to do it, so he doesn't make a complete count, but the count that he took was enough to get the nation in trouble anyway, because soon after the count that he gets done is reported back to David, it's going to say that God strikes Israel in a way that gets David's attention. And it doesn't exactly say how God struck Israel, but it prompted David to ask for mercy, at which point God is going to send the prophet Gad to David to let him know he's got three options: 3 years of famine, 3 months of his enemies chasing him down, or 3 days of the Lord's sword. And David, understanding that God is merciful, does not want to have any kind of consequence that leaves him to the discretion of his enemies. And so he picks the sword of the Lord. It's going to be pretty bad, but true to David's reasoning, God does stop short of completely destroying Jerusalem. And so once he pauses the pestilence, which is the form that the sword of the Lord took, he's going to send another word to David, telling him to build an altar at the threshing floor of a man called Ornan the Jebusite, something that David is going to get done. And once David sees that, God answers him from that location. He decides that that will be the place from which he will make offerings to God and seek his counsel from then on. Because once he has seen the angel of the Lord standing over Jerusalem, causing all that destruction, he is no longer confident enough to go back to the place where the tabernacle has already been erected. And so he is not only going to make this the new place from which he makes offerings and inquiries of God, but in the next chapter, we're going to see that it is going to be the location for the temple. But before we get there, a couple of things caught my attention, not the least of which was the way in which David's commitment to understanding God's tendencies helped bail him out of this huge mistake. A mistake that not only cost him, but really cost the nation of Israel more than it cost David personally. And so in understanding God's tendency to be merciful to those who have shown themselves merciful to others, David found what looks like the best way out of the situation, understanding all the years that he had not only spent being loyal to God and trying to accomplish his purposes, but basically being merciful to those he found along the way, even those like Saul, who had tried to kill him. And so now it was paying off in David understanding the best way out of a really bad situation. More than that, he didn't simply understand God's historical tendencies. He was perceptive of the ways that God was responding to his efforts to make amends for what he had done. And that ended up leading him down a path that God eventually began to bless. And finally, if he had paid more attention to that simple question that Joab had asked him from the beginning, why, he might have gotten a chance to be just as insightful into his own motives as he was into God's tendencies to show mercy, avoiding the need for the mercy in the first place if he simply checked his motives. And even though the chapter does not specifically tell us why David wanted to number Israel, the fact that he seemed unable to answer Joab's question, why do you want to do this, seems like it should have been a huge red flag. Why? Because the word says, the heart is deceitful above all things, desperately wicked. Who can know it? And so David was in a situation where not being able to answer his why put him in the position of potentially assigning healthy motives to a project that might have actually had some shadier motives, understanding that David spent the early part of his life being looked over. And I just know from personal experience, there are times when I've been looked over, but when I finally got to a period of success, might have overcompensated in some of the things that I was doing during a time when I was being blessed after having been ignored. And so we can't say what David's motive was here, but even as flawed a man as Joab was, he saw something problematic in David's motives and challenged David to reevaluate his why, something that David ignored until it became painfully obvious that Joab was actually on the same page as God. And so the good news for David is that the catastrophe that followed helped him to quickly reevaluate his why and attach it to a legitimate purpose that was going to benefit the entire nation. But my prayer for you is my prayer for me. To the degree that we are blessed enough to have people in our lives, no matter how flawed, who are willing to challenge us to give a clear answer to our why. We take it as an opportunity to, if we can't clearly answer the question about our why or our motives, that we at least ask God to help us understand whether or not the thing that we are doing is actually the best way forward, which is why we often say God's best to you as you go forward in him.